Everyone thought I was lucky to live with my son. That's how I disappeared right in front of everyone. People saw a quiet American street, trimmed lawns, flags hanging steady on porches, neighbors waving like everything was just fine. They saw comfort. They saw security. What they didn't see was how quickly a woman can fade inside the very house she once helped build, and how silence starts feeling like the safest language you can speak. I didn't understand it at first. I only felt it, that slow, careful shrinking. My name is Margaret Collins. For most of my life, I believed love meant making room for others, even when it asked you to step aside. I raised my son Ethan that way. I taught him patience, restraint, the kind of decency people compliment you for later. After his father passed, it was just the two of us for years. We learned how to survive quietly, how to keep things together without leaning too hard on anyone. So when Ethan married Claire and asked me to move in after my knee surgery, it sounded reasonable. Temporary, even. He said it would be easier this way. He said, "You won't have to worry about a thing, Mom." Outside this house, Ethan was admired. Neighbors talked about how good he was, how responsible. People at church smiled at him, told him he was doing the right thing, that not every son steps up like that anymore. Sometimes they said it right in front of me. I smiled back, proud of him and strangely unseen at the same time. The house itself looked perfect. Open kitchen, clean lines, sunlight filling the rooms like it belonged there. Claire had arranged everything with care. She liked things precise, efficient, settled. To everyone else, she was warmth wrapped in politeness. She poured coffee, asked thoughtful questions, laughed softly at the right moments. Neighbors told me how lucky I was to have such a considerate daughter-in-law. I nodded, because disagreeing felt impolite, almost unnecessary. Behind closed doors, nothing was openly cruel. That's what made it hard to explain. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, nothing dramatic enough to point to. Just small adjustments I was expected to accept without comment. My breakfast plate placed slightly farther away while my knee stiffened. Toast left on the counter until it cooled, the faint smell of burnt bread lingering longer than it should have. My medication shifted from the counter to a cabinet that creaked loudly every time I opened it, as if announcing that I was slower now. Claire never said don't. She didn't need to. A pause. A slight lift of her eyebrow. The soft click of a container being closed before I reached it. Once, I went for leftover chicken salad and felt her eyes on me before she spoke. "Oh, I was saving that," she said lightly, already turning away. The refrigerator hummed behind me. I closed the door gently, my hand resting on the handle longer than necessary. At first, I told myself it was random. Normal household rhythm. Then I noticed it wasn't. It always happened when Ethan wasn't around. It always happened when I hesitated. It always happened in ways that looked reasonable if someone walked in halfway through. That's when I stopped reacting and started paying attention. Watching. Remembering. Collecting details quietly, like things I might need later, even if I didn't yet know why. Ethan worked long hours. When he came home, he wanted peace. I understood that. When I mentioned feeling a little out of place once, he smiled tiredly and said, "Come on, Mom, you're overthinking again. Just relax." He didn't look at me when he said it. His eyes stayed on his phone, thumb scrolling, already elsewhere. Claire stood nearby, wiping the counter, not missing a beat. The moment passed without argument, without resolution. Days settled into a routine. I moved carefully, like a guest who didn't know when she was supposed to leave. I folded blankets twice, cleaned up immediately, lowered my voice mid-sentence if someone entered the room. Independence is admired here, and needing anything feels like a personal failure. I reminded myself of that whenever my chest tightened. The living room changed without discussion. My chair angled slightly away from the television. The volume stayed low when I watched, louder when others did. Claire often said, "I've got it covered," before I finished a sentence. Polite. Efficient. Final. I began apologizing for things that weren't wrong. Sorry for asking. Sorry for moving slowly. Sorry for being there. "Mom, you don't have to say sorry all the time," Ethan said once, half smiling. He didn't wait for an answer. Evenings were the quietest. Appliances hummed. Kitchen lights reflected off spotless counters. Ethan and Claire talked about work, plans, weekends. I sat nearby, present but unnecessary. When I tried to join in, the conversation shifted, then drifted back without me. I learned when to stop speaking. Listening didn't inconvenience anyone. I told myself I should be grateful. I had a roof, food, safety. Wanting more felt selfish. Wanting respect felt dramatic. So I adjusted. Again and again. The first time Ethan said it plainly was over something small. I mentioned being tired. Maybe overwhelmed. He sighed, rubbed his face, and finally looked at me briefly. Mom, he said, slower this time. This isn't a big deal. Just adjust. We all do. Then he looked away. Claire didn't pause her movement. The room stayed quiet long enough for the words to settle. My hands tightened in my lap. My breath caught, just slightly. In that silence, I realized how many times I already had adjusted and how little of myself was left each time I did. I nodded. Of course I did. But something closed inside me then, heavy and final, like a door left open too long. I understood, in that moment, that explaining myself had become a burden, and I didn't yet know how expensive that lesson would be, only that from that day forward, I would speak less, watch more, and begin choosing my silence with intention. After that conversation, nothing changed on the surface. And that, I learned, was the point. The house continued exactly as it had before, clean, calm, controlled. Mornings still arrived quietly, sunlight slipping through the kitchen window, the low hum of the refrigerator steady and indifferent. Claire still moved through the space with practiced efficiency, her footsteps light, her voice pleasant, her authority unspoken but absolute. Ethan still kissed her cheek before work, still grabbed his coffee, still said, "See you later," without noticing who was standing nearby. What changed was me. I stopped filling the silence. I stopped explaining my intentions before I acted. I learned to move through the house the way you move through someone else's world, careful not to leave fingerprints. I woke earlier than everyone else, not because I needed to, but because it was easier to exist before expectations woke up too. In those quiet hours, the house felt neutral. Empty counters. No glances. No corrections. Just space. Breakfast became a private ritual. I made my toast and ate it standing by the counter, listening to the faint ticking of the clock above the sink. When Claire came in later, she smiled, surprised. "Oh, you're already done?" she said, like it was helpful information. I nodded. She rearranged the counter anyway. It wasn't the actions themselves anymore. It was the timing, the consistency, the way things were always just out of reach but never fully denied. I noticed how groceries I liked stopped appearing, how my laundry was moved before I finished folding it, how my chair was shifted back an inch, then another, until I was slightly outside the conversation circle without anyone having to say a word. Ethan didn't see any of it. Or maybe he did and chose not to. When I mentioned feeling tired one afternoon, he laughed softly and said, "Mom, you've got it good here. Don't make it harder than it needs to be." He said it like advice. Like kindness. Claire nodded beside him, already agreeing. I began to document things in my head. Not emotionally, methodically. The days Claire reminded Ethan about his mother's appointments, but never asked if I needed help. The nights my pain medication sat untouched because the bottle had been moved again. The way the grandchildren, sweet and unintentional, started mirroring the tone around them. "Grandma, that's not where that goes," one of them said once, copying Claire's careful voice. I smiled and fixed it. Of course I did. Afternoons stretched long. I spent more time in my room, door half closed, listening to the sounds of a house that didn't quite belong to me anymore. Footsteps. Cabinets. Laughter that didn't include me but wasn't meant to hurt. That was the hardest part. Nothing was openly hostile. Everything was defensible. If I said something, I would sound sensitive. Difficult. Old. One day, a neighbor stopped by while I was outside on the porch, easing my knee into the sun. She looked around and said, "You must feel so taken care of here." Her tone was warm. Genuine. I thanked her, because correcting her felt exhausting. When she left, Claire stepped out and said, "That was nice," like we had shared something. I nodded. The gap between what people saw and what I lived widened quietly. Inside, patterns continued. Dinners where my plate was placed last. Conversations that shifted when I spoke. Decisions made without asking, then explained as conveniences. "It's just easier this way," Claire said once, smiling. I believed her. Or at least, I wanted to. Ethan remained distant in a way that hurt more than anger would have. When I tried to explain how small things were adding up, He rubbed his forehead and said, "Mom, you're reading too much into this." His voice was calm. Final. Claire stayed silent, her eyes on the counter, letting him handle it. Her silence worked better than any argument. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry. I was alert. I felt awake in a way I hadn't before. The fog of self-blame began to thin. This wasn't chaos. It was design. So I adjusted again, but differently. I stopped correcting Claire when she misremembered things. I stopped offering explanations. I stopped trying to earn space. I let the house operate exactly as it wanted to. I took notes mentally. Who spoke for me? Who spoke over me? Who benefited from my quiet? In the stillness, clarity grew. And for the first time since I had moved in, I understood something important. Silence had been protecting them, not me. That understanding didn't make me loud. It made me patient. And patience, I was learning, could be its own kind of power. The afternoons had begun to blur together, a slow, unbroken chain of careful movements and quiet observations. I found myself lingering in corners of the house I had once ignored, sitting just beyond the hum of the refrigerator, listening to Claire organize the cupboards in that same meticulous way she always did. Everything she touched had purpose, precision, perfection, and I watched, cataloging each subtle shift. My knees ached in the chair, but I ignored it, letting the pain anchor me into awareness. I had learned that discomfort sharpened observation. Ethan drifted through the house, barely glancing at me. He would pass by, phone in hand, speaking with his usual casual detachment. "Mom, it's all fine. Don't sweat it," he said one evening, his tone light, dismissive, eyes not meeting mine. The words themselves were harmless. The weight came from the pause before he spoke, from the way he avoided acknowledging that the home he called ours was quietly mine no longer. Claire hovered behind him, a quiet smile plastered across her face, one hand brushing over the counter as if she were protecting it from me. Her silence had become its own language, and I understood it fluently. I had begun cataloging everything mentally, almost as though I were running a silent ledger. Who spoke for me? Who spoke over me? Who rearranged things without a glance in my direction? Small gestures, easily overlooked, a plate left cooling longer than necessary, a glass moved an inch further from my reach, a newspaper folded away before I could read it. At first, I had questioned my own perception, afraid the loneliness of my mornings had distorted reality. But each repetition, each microshift, each soft, deliberate nudge away from inclusion reinforced the pattern. It wasn't random. It was choreographed. One morning, I decided to step outside, leaning on the railing and feeling the crisp air against my face. I noticed the neighbor across the street, waving cheerfully at Claire as she carried a grocery bag. Claire waved back, bright and perfect, then glanced in my direction with that same careful, measured look. The recognition was polite but brief. No warmth. No acknowledgement of shared history, of years spent nurturing this family. I took a deep breath and let it settle. The difference between public perception and private reality was stark, unavoidable. By the third week, even the grandchildren were beginning to mirror the subtle hierarchy Claire enforced. "Grandma, shouldn't you move that?" one said, echoing Claire's careful tone. I smiled faintly, arranging the object quietly myself. It was harmless in isolation, but the repetition revealed the depth of influence. I wasn't just being edged out, I was being rewritten into the household narrative, invisibly, gently, persistently. That evening, I attempted what had once been my way of bridging the gap. I spoke to Ethan about my growing sense of displacement. "I just feel pushed to the edges," I said softly, careful not to sound accusatory. He looked at me, mouth tightening for a brief second, then let it relax. "Mom, really? You're reading too much into it," he said, a shrug accentuating the words. He didn't scold, didn't argue. He simply didn't see it as a problem. Claire, standing just behind him, nodded, lips tight. Her silence weighed heavier than any rebuke could have. I left the room and closed my door gently, listening to the faint sounds of dinner preparations downstairs. That night, lying in bed, I catalogued again. Not with despair, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Every adjustment I had made to accommodate the comfort of others, every softening of my voice, every overlooked slight, they had protected them, not me. And in recognizing this, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a quiet, unshakable resolve. The following days were a subtle choreography of presence and absence. I learned to make small acts of autonomy, choosing my own chair at the table, starting my own projects without seeking acknowledgement, speaking only when spoken to, and even then with minimal explanation. Claire noticed, briefly startled, but quickly recovered, smiling that same polished smile, as if nothing had changed. Ethan barely noticed, or perhaps he did and ignored it. Either way, I had begun reclaiming my space, quietly, deliberately, without confrontation. One afternoon, a delivery person left a package at the door. Claire appeared, hands on hips, glancing inside the house as if evaluating her domain. I stepped out, leaning on my cane, and accepted the package. She said nothing. Ethan walked past, phone in hand, barely raising his eyes. But in that small, ordinary interaction, I caught something, a micro-expression, fleeting, almost imperceptible. Surprise? Disapproval? Recognition that I had stepped forward, slightly, without asking permission. My pulse quickened, not with fear, but with awareness. The observer in me noted the shift. By evening, I felt the pattern crystallizing. It wasn't about grand gestures. It was about control, influence, the way Claire orchestrated the rhythms of the house so carefully that no one could argue with them. And yet, the more I observed, the more I understood that silence, patience, and small, deliberate acts of self-preservation were my allies. I began planning my own moves quietly, rearranging my medications so they were accessible, keeping a log of appointments and deliveries, noting moments when my presence was acknowledged or ignored. I realized, finally, that this silent endurance had transformed. I was no longer a passive participant. I was awake, collecting evidence, mapping patterns, observing behaviors. The weight of every dismissive glance, every small exclusion, was becoming a guide. And that understanding, that quiet, steady awareness, would be the foundation of what was to come. Even in the evenings, as Claire prepared meals and Ethan worked at his laptop, I felt the pulse of the house differently. Not as a space where I had to tiptoe. Not as a stage where I was invisible. But as a terrain I was learning to navigate with subtlety, precision, and dignity. Each microaggression was catalogued. Each polite exclusion was noted. And in the quiet corners of the home, I felt a stirring that hadn't existed before. Readiness. The part of me that had once adjusted endlessly, that had explained endlessly, was now simply observing, waiting, and planning. The awakening wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't require confrontation or shouts. It was the deep, slow turning of perception, the gathering of threads, the quiet understanding that protection had been for them, and that I could now choose differently. And as I lay down that night, I felt a sense of quiet strength settle over me. The story of my presence in this house was no longer theirs to write alone. Days passed like the slow drift of clouds across a winter sky, each one subtly etching a new understanding in my mind. The routines that once felt suffocating now had a rhythm I could anticipate, almost manipulate. I learned to move with quiet purpose, choosing when to speak, when to remain still, when to nod politely without giving myself away. Claire maintained her polished smile, her eyes always calculating, always just enough warmth to keep others convinced she was the model daughter-in-law. But I could read the micro-flinches, the fractional hesitations she never intended me to notice. Ethan remained distant, perpetually absorbed in his work, phone, or some casual project that seemed urgent only to him. One evening, as I carried a tray of herbal tea into the living room, he glanced up and said, "Mom, you're overthinking again." His tone was breezy, offhand, but the pause before he spoke, the slight tilt of his head, the avoidance of eye contact, revealed his real message. He didn't want to see. He didn't want to confront the discomfort he was trained to dismiss. And that small realization, quietly observed, tightened something in my chest. I began taking small liberties within the house, testing the waters without a word. I adjusted the thermostat slightly higher on cold nights, left a throw blanket in the living room, and let the grandchildren find their own small routines without Claire's constant monitoring. Each act was minor, imperceptible, but it shifted the subtle balance. The household was a living organism, and I was learning to influence it, quietly, strategically, without confrontation. One afternoon, I caught a glimpse of Claire's expression that stopped me cold. She had dropped a coffee cup, just a little crack forming along its side. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered, eyes darting to Ethan. The micro-expression was enough: annoyance, frustration, a flicker of impatience. I noted it, mentally cataloging it alongside every minor exclusion, every polite dismissal. These were the cracks I could watch, wait for, and eventually use. The children were becoming more overt in their mimicry. "Grandma, are you sure about that?" one asked, echoing Claire's careful, almost surgical tone. I smiled, letting them finish their sentence without interruption. The repetition of her control in their voices, though subtle, was undeniable. And yet, I refused to react with frustration. That was the power of silence. I had learned it long ago, and now I wielded it deliberately. Then, something new happened. A neighbor, whom I had rarely spoken to beyond nodding hellos, paused while passing the house. She commented casually, "You've got such a quiet presence. It's hard not to notice." Her eyes lingered on me for a beat too long, and in that moment, I realized that my invisibility was not absolute. Others could see. Others could acknowledge what I had endured in silence. The thought was quietly intoxicating, a reminder that the world beyond these walls still existed, and I had a place in it. I began to notice other subtle shifts. Claire, for all her careful planning, started leaving small things unattended: a folded shirt left in the wrong drawer, a book misplaced. Ethan still didn't notice, still too absorbed in his own casual blindness. But I cataloged every detail, every tiny inconsistency, every unguarded moment. It became a puzzle, a pattern, a silent narrative unfolding before me. And for the first time in years, I felt the faint stirrings of anticipation. One evening, after dinner, I took a seat near the window, watching the backyard glow under the last light of day. Ethan and the children were inside, laughter echoing faintly from the kitchen. Claire came past me, brushing against the counter, and for a moment, she didn't speak. Her eyes flicked briefly toward me, just enough to acknowledge presence without engagement. I felt a calm satisfaction in that small interaction. Recognition without confrontation. I was beginning to occupy my space in ways she had not accounted for. I also began introducing subtle boundaries. I kept a few personal items in a corner of the kitchen. Small things that Claire might have dismissed, but which marked a quiet assertion of my presence. A favorite teacup, a small handwritten notebook, a reading lamp. She noticed, briefly, a tiny raise of the eyebrow, a shift in the way she moved around the objects. And yet, she said nothing. Ethan remained unaware. The household rhythm seemed unchanged to anyone else, but I had begun to tilt it imperceptibly, without sound, without accusation. Sleep brought clarity. I would lie awake, knees aching, notebook in hand, recording small events, micro-interactions, patterns in tone and glance. The silent endurance phase had evolved. No longer was I simply adjusting, explaining, or apologizing. I was observing with purpose, learning how to navigate the invisible currents of control, influence, and dismissal. The weight of each polite exclusion, each carefully measured interaction, was becoming my guide. One night, as I brewed a cup of chamomile tea, I caught a fleeting smile from Ethan, one that didn't reach his eyes, but which held just a whisper of realization. He didn't say anything. He probably didn't even know why he felt it. But I did. Every silent slight, every polite dominance, every microaggression was lining up, forming a narrative that only I could read. And in that quiet understanding, I felt a faint thrill. The awakening was near. The house, which had once felt suffocating, began to pulse with new possibilities. Every unnoticed action, every ignored gesture, every small act of passive control by Claire was now an open book to me. I cataloged, I waited, I planned. Not with malice, but with intention. My silence was no longer passive, it was deliberate. Each day, each micro-moment, each carefully observed interaction brought me closer to clarity, to readiness, to the day when the truths long hidden would surface naturally. And as I sat there, watching the backyard darken into night, I understood something vital. The house was mine in subtle ways I hadn't yet claimed. The world outside could see me, the neighbor's words had reminded me. The family inside would have to reckon with me eventually, not through shouting, but through the undeniable weight of reality. Every act of adjustment, every whispered, "just relax," or "just adjust," had finally brought me to this edge. And from here, patience and observation would be my most powerful allies. I felt no anger, only a quiet satisfaction. I had survived, endured, and now I was awake. And when the time came to step forward, to speak or to act, it would be on my terms, calm, unshakable, and undeniable. The next phase was coming, and I was ready. I woke that morning with a calm I hadn't felt in years, the kind of stillness that only comes after the storm has been studied, understood, and mapped in one's mind. Claire was bustling around the kitchen, as always, her movements precise, her voice honeyed when Ethan came in from work. He nodded politely, unaware as ever of the quiet weight hanging in the corners of the house. I carried my cup of tea to the window, observing the rhythm of our life as though it were a clock I could read without anyone knowing I had learned the mechanism. It wasn't the big moments that mattered anymore. It was the micro moments, the tiny cracks in Claire's armor. She had underestimated the quiet power of a woman who had endured years of polite erasure. The cabinet door she left slightly ajar, the tea towel carelessly tossed onto the counter, the way she hummed a note slightly off-key, all of these small details now spoke volumes to me. And for the first time, I felt a deep sense of alignment between my patience and my purpose. Later that day, Ethan asked for my help with some papers he was reviewing. I moved into the office, careful not to reveal the swelling satisfaction in my chest. Claire followed briefly, offering to help in that soft, measured tone that had been her weapon for so long. I let her, silently, while cataloging each gesture, each tiny inflection in her voice. Her dominance was still visible. But her control was no longer invisible. It had begun to expose itself simply by existing. I placed a set of important documents on her desk, items she had been subtly trying to manipulate in the past, and waited quietly. She paused, her fingers hovering over the papers. Her eyes flicked up at me, and in that brief exchange, I caught the first real hint of unease. Not anger, not confrontation, just the faint tremor of someone realizing that the rules they had relied upon were shifting. I said nothing. I didn't need to. My silence was more potent than any argument I could have made. Ethan, as usual, glanced up, said something casual about deadlines, and returned to his laptop. He still didn't see the full picture, and perhaps he never would, not in that moment. But the seeds had been planted, and the subtle cracks in perception were beginning to widen. I understood that my battle was never about loud confrontation. It was about truth surfacing naturally, like sunlight through the blinds. The grandchildren came bounding in later, laughter filling the air. One of them dropped a cup, and as Claire bent to pick it up, she barely concealed her irritation. I caught the faintest tightening around her eyes, a subtle shift in posture, a sigh swallowed too quickly. I smiled quietly to myself, sipping my tea. The household, once a field of carefully maintained illusions, was now a stage where truth could finally step into the spotlight. By evening, I had begun leaving small hints for Ethan, a note on the fridge, a carefully documented list of household expenses, a gentle comment on overlooked chores, each designed to highlight patterns he had never noticed. He didn't react overtly, but I could sense the shift, subtle and slow, like ripples moving across still water. He would eventually connect the dots. The awareness would come, as always, after the lesson had been observed quietly. Then came the moment I had waited for. Claire made a misstep in front of a neighbor, the one who had once commented on my quiet presence. A casual remark from the neighbor, a fleeting look, and suddenly, the polished veneer Claire had worn like armor cracked. I watched silently as she tried to recover, her careful tone faltering. Ethan looked between us, his eyebrows knitting slightly, though he said nothing. The truth had revealed itself, not with a shout, but with the undeniable clarity of accumulated evidence and observation. I realized in that moment that my long years of patience, endurance, and meticulous observation had brought me here. No argument had been necessary. No raised voice. Justice, slow and quiet, had arrived on its own. And I, Margaret Collins, had not only witnessed it but facilitated it, with dignity intact and strength quietly asserted. The evening settled, and I found a rare moment alone in the garden. The fading light brushed the edges of the house, highlighting the quiet corners where so many invisible battles had been fought. I inhaled deeply, letting the calm fill me, and reflected on the journey. It had been long, measured, and precise, just like I preferred. Silence had been my tool, observation my guide, and patience my ally. As I closed the garden gate behind me, I felt a release I hadn't known in years. Claire's missteps, Ethan's eventual understanding, the children's shifting behavior, all of it converged into a reality that no one could deny. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand recognition. But in every glance, every subtle reaction, every micro-moment, my value had been asserted. I had reclaimed my space, my dignity, and my life. I smiled softly, knowing that the household, the neighborhood, and even my son would eventually acknowledge the truth. But more importantly, I acknowledged it for myself. And in that acknowledgement, I felt free. They learned too late that silence isn't weakness. I didn't raise my voice. I raised my value.